pension fund in Birmingham is appears to be complex, and I think it is intended to be complex, because if it was straightforward, we'd all know what to do. And one of the things, again, Dave and I say to each other when it comes to looking at this, and I know some of you will find this difficult, but we have to say to ourselves, stop thinking like a Tory. And the reason for that is because pension funds are all, locked up with capitalism and fund management and so on and so forth. It's an area where the Tories are at home, and they want to be on their turf. They want to be able to have discussions based on those sort of things. So the first thing to do here is to try to stop thinking like a Tory, and we try our best not to think like a Tory. One of the things, before I carry on, that I want to try to get across tonight is one specific thing which Dave and I would like to come out of this meeting. Lots of campaigns going on across the city to stop the cuts, but there is one thing which I think is we think would make a difference, and it is a recertification, expedited recertification of the employer's contributions to the West Midlands Pension Fund. That is a crucial next stage, because Max Corler, the Gove's chief commissioner, has admitted in his letter to the Birmingham Mail that eventually there will be a return of some of these over contributions. Now, that will happen as he sees it, and as the West Midlands Pension Fund sees it in the fullness of time. And what that means is they'll do a revaluation. It will take a year for them to work it out. And then in the meantime, all of these further cuts, 150 million pounds and a 50 million pounds that they've found again, will have taken place. So the reality is we have to have a recertification now, and it has to be expedited. Now, this is the crucial aspect in some ways of tonight, that you go away from this meeting and you ask for recertification, okay? And a refund, effectively, of the overpayments to the pension fund that have taken place over the last 10 years at least. Now, what I can probably, if I can work out the screen sharing situation, can you see this on your screen now? A Happy New Year.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Okay, just so you know, there is another aspect to what's going on, and that is that in addition to the payments that have been made, overpayments that have been made to the pension fund over the last several years, in order for Birmingham City Council's share of the pension fund to be looked after, investment managers have to be paid. And you're seeing on the screen now how much we've paid those investment managers since April the 1st last year. And you'll see it's running, you can see it second by second, you'll be pleased to see. And just bearing in mind the kinds of cuts that are taking place in Birmingham, especially the kinds of figures that are being used, well, it's worth bearing in mind that we will be paying £34 million this year directly in investment managers' expenses. Okay, now, personally, I think that's an absolute scandal. And it doesn't just happen in Birmingham, I have to say. It's something which is crucial on this sort of Tory maths side of things. And that's because we start from a situation where, let's say, if you're a doctor or a teacher or a nurse, or you work in the civil service for the UK government, or if you work in the military, or if you're in the judiciary, you every month, like local government workers, you pay a certain amount of your salary into a pension scheme, and your employer does so as well. Now, what people perhaps don't understand is that because of reasons lost in the mists of time, local government workers have a different system. Because you might think that teachers and doctors and nurses and so on have a little bit of money put in a pot, which is then paid out to them when they retire. That's not the case. These are what are called unfunded pension schemes. So what that means is the government takes in the money, can spend it, but it doesn't put it into a fund. It just so happens that when those teachers and doctors and nurses retire, the state pays their pension, having taken contributions during the course of that doctor or nurse or teacher's working lifetime. There is not a fund, okay? However, for local government workers, there is an actual fund. So every month, all of that money that comes out the salaries actually goes to the West Midlands Pension Fund in Wolverhampton, and it's actually in a fund. And that fund has £20 billion in it as we speak. Now, you might think, well, that's good. That's good for local government workers, and there's a nice big fund there that's going to pay out for their pensions. By the way, the average pension is about £4,000 a year. By the way, just set aside the £27 million we've already paid this year to the pension fund managers. The problem is this: if you take a look at the contributions that are made to the pension fund, and then you look at the pensions that are paid out from the pension fund, they match. In other words, the contributions that are paid in, or rather the pensions that are paid out, are covered by the contributions that are paid in by current workers. And you have to ask yourself the question, what on earth is the £20 billion for? Yeah. Because actually, the contributions are covering the pensions. And I'll tell you what they're for. They are there to be fed upon by the markets and investment managers in London. And it's got nothing to do, in London and in Wall Street and across the markets of the world. So the contributions that have been made are enough. There was no need for a pension fund of £20 billion. But what's happened is Tory maths has determined that contributions will be made on the basis of once a year making a decision about how much has to be paid out in the future to all the people who are in the pension fund. It's a pointless exercise. It does not relate to reality. And the problem has been that since 2010, the normal Tory maths that actually works on pension funds has caused an absolute disaster. And that is that local councils have been forced to pay massive employers' contributions. And at one point, I think it was in 2021, 22, 37% of the employers' salaries were having to be paid into the fund by Birmingham City Council. These were unnecessary, and they were unnecessary because of a failure to act by successive Conservative secretaries of state at the Department of Communities and Local Government. What should have happened was, at some point in the last 10 years, there should have been an intervention because the Tory maths was going wrong. And what was happening was that pension fund liabilities were soaring because of the intervention by the government to save the banks and to save the markets in the early 2010s. And that was quantitative easing. This meant that what's called the discount rate, which is what pension funds use to work out how much they owe, was a false one. But still, pension funds were being required to use very low discount rates to determine what their liabilities were. Now, what's happened is the markets have sort of righted themselves. And because the pension funds panicked and started to ask for contributions to meet these ridiculous calculations that they were making in the certainly the late 2010s and definitely the early 2020s, we ended up with, when the Tory maths changed and had to change, we ended up with massive surpluses in these pension funds. And it's our judgment, and if I can just show you something on my screen here. This is, by the way, what happened last week on the stock markets. You'll see that last April, at the beginning of the financial year, that's where the stock market was. Last Friday, it went up to this level. There's been a huge increase. This is not good news in some senses for the West Midlands Pension Fund, because what it means is that their assets have increased by 8%. Now, you may think that's a good thing. But in fact, what has also happened is that, again, if I can share this with you. Sorry, I'm probably showing the wrong thing here. But what's also happened is that let me just stop that sharing for a second. Yeah. What's happened is that the discount rate which is used to work out how much the pension fund owes has also gone up. And as the discount rate goes up, the liabilities come down. The two things together last week have got us to a situation where I believe that in 10 weeks' time, the West Midlands Pension Fund is likely to have a surplus. They've got more money than they should have, of around about £4.5 billion. And what that will also mean is that Birmingham City Council's accounts will show that they've got a surplus of £1.5 billion. And this money that's been paid in over the last several years has been absolutely pointless. And it's actually been effectively been stored up in the City Council's accounts. Now, what happens is every 3 years, pension funds have to make a decision about how much the employer is going to pay for the next 3 years. The problem was that Birmingham City Council's contributions were set in 2022, when all these ridiculous Tory maths were suggesting there was a massive liability in the pension fund. We knew that there wasn't, because it was quite clear that the wrong figures were being used left, right, and centre across the whole industry. So what we have now is an opportunity to say the figures were wrong in 2022. They must now be recertified, and we must receive a refund, an effective refund to the City Council into its revenues. And the way you do that is the West Midlands Pension Fund has to recertify how much the employer should pay. And without getting into too much technicalities, it will effectively give a refund into revenue over the next 3 years. What we want to happen is we do not want to wait until 2026 for them to eventually work this out. What we want is a recertification now, and based on current figures and the likelihood of where these pension fund liabilities are going to be. So it is absolutely essential that the next step should be recertification and refund. And that should be a cause for pausing the cuts until we know those figures. It should be expedited. Now, we know that the City Council have not responded since December the 3rd and to our action plan that we also then put out, which calls first and foremost for a recertification. So the person who can actually direct that there is a recertification is the Secretary of State for local government. And that is the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner. She can direct that such a recertification can take place. Now, one of the problems we've had in Birmingham in terms of MPs and councillors engaging with this is that I think they feel that Keir Starmer made a statement about the intervention in Birmingham last year, and he said we should let the commissioners get on with their jobs. Now, it turns out that the jobs that they are actually engaged in are Tory maths jobs. Yep. And it is Michael Gove's maths that they are using. And it's high time that Keir Starmer got off the fence and started to look at this, because this is a scandal, an absolute scandal. And it's not just in Birmingham, I have to say. And it's perfectly possible that if there is a surplus of £1.5 billion in Birmingham's share of the pension fund, which we think there will be in 10 weeks' time, that we could see a considerable return to revenue. We pay about £120 million a year at the moment in employers' contributions. It could be zero, and it could be zero for 2 years. It could be zero for 3 years. The reality, and this has happened in Scotland, because Scotland do their revaluation a year earlier, they've already started giving the money back. There's another pension fund in London, Kensington and Chelsea. They've started giving the money back because they've spotted that there's too much money there. They should never have asked for these. And if any, probably the one person who is most responsible for this mess up is Michael Gove, ironically, because he should have stepped in when he was Secretary of State, and he should have worked out, because DCLG know the figures, they should have worked out that Birmingham, more than anywhere else, was overpaying. And if I can just to conclude, if I can sort of show you how big the overpayments were, I'll try and share the screen with the figures here. Okay, let me just try and share the screen. Do apologize. Okay, can you see that set of figures there?
Yeah.
So that's how much we've paid, Birmingham has paid as an employer to the pension fund. Okay, you'll see that towards the end of the 20s, they were paying 36% of the employer's contributions as the employer's contributions. It's come down to 27%, but this is where all of this build-up happened, because, again, can you see this figure here?
Not really.
Sorry, can you see? You should be able to see a set of figures starting with Birmingham and then Nottingham. Can you see those?
Yeah.
What you'll see is, whilst Birmingham was paying 37% in 22-23 in employers' contributions, here's what everyone else was paying at the same time. Nottingham, 17%, as opposed to 37%. Bristol, 20%. These are the 10 core cities in the UK. This is the difference. And this is why Birmingham was completely different to everywhere else, because they asked for too much money. They panicked and they asked for too much money. And essentially, for the past 10 years, if Birmingham as an employer had paid 16% instead of these ridiculous figures, we would be 100% funded. There wouldn't have been any overpayments to the fund. And this is why we're asking for recertification. And Michael Gove, who was the secretary, and before him, Robert Jenrick, and before him, Sajid Javid, okay, the three amigos, they should have intervened, not just in terms of what was going on in Birmingham, but also across the whole country, because even these figures here were getting a little bit too high across the piece. So what we have to do is to bear in mind that in addition to the fact that we are paying, I mean, across the whole country, United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, so England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, the pension funds all joined together are over $500 billion. Those are the pension funds. Those are the figures. And last year, 2024, all of the local government pension funds paid, wait for it, £2.5 billion in management expenses. Okay. If Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer don't sort this out and intervene, because quite clearly their Gove-appointed commissioner is not going to intervene, over the course of the next 4 years of a Labour government, we will have paid, it's the taxpayers, because this goes directly to the investment managers, we will hand over £10 billion in investment management expenses. £10 billion. Just so you know, that's how much the WASPI women, it was going to cost to pay for the WASPI women. Every year, the winter fuel allowance costs £2.5 billion, or did cost £2.5 billion. But we are choosing instead to hand over £2.5 billion to the investment fund managers across the country of the 100 or so pension funds. It's a scandal, and it will start to bite the government, especially as we come up to local elections. Because what's going to happen is there's going to be still cuts are taking place in places like Birmingham, but we are still in a situation where pension funds are getting more and more, and their managers are getting more and more. So I hope you can understand why the next stage has to be, yes, carry on with all the various campaigns that are going on across the city, but please, the real effort we need to get into is to try to persuade either the council itself or the Secretary of State to have an immediate and expedited recertification of Birmingham City Council's contributions, so that we can then roll those numbers into the kind of figures that are being bandied around at the moment in terms of cuts. And that, I think if that recertification is not asked for, I think that could be the basis for a judicial review of the either the government's failure to order it or Birmingham City Council's failure to ask for it. Now, there are 800 employers in the West Midlands Pension Fund. And it is perfectly possible one of those other employers will ask for recertification. Our understanding is that Coventry University, which is in the fund, may ask for recertification. So, first of all, thanks for listening to me. It is a complex subject, but really, this is about, and from my point of view, these pension funds are part of the state. If these pension funds went bust, and in 2008 they nearly did, by the way, the government would stand behind them. Local government workers will still get their pensions paid. So, in fact, this is a real concern, because this £20 billion that's in the West Midlands Pension Fund, it's effectively a quasi-sovereign wealth fund, and it should be treated as such, and it should be used to invest in the West Midlands in particular. So, as I say, I hope one of the things we can do is to try to put pressure on the MPs to ask the Secretary of State, Angela Rayner, to order a recertification, get the councillors to realise that it's not really, the Labour Party wasn't necessarily at fault on this in terms of the fact that they were in opposition, but I think they ought to realise that this was the failure of Gove and Jenrick and Sajid Javid to act. And you have to ask yourself, why didn't they act? Well, if your friends in the city are getting £2.5 billion a year for doing pretty much nothing, that might explain it. Thanks very much for listening. I'll answer any questions if I need to.